understand is that the Assad regime has a pattern of using chemical weapons against its own people, against the Chemical Weapons Convention, despite the fact that they had agreed to it, and despite the fact that the Russians were their guarantors. So what happens next has everything to do with what the Assad regime decides to do. And it has everything to do with what the Russian government decides to enable as well. Stephanie?
Thanks, Anna. Why does the administration, just talk a little bit about this, and you guys have touched on this, but why does the administration feel these strikes are enough to deter the Assad regime from using chemical weapons again?
I'll pass it to the general in a second. We were very methodical in making the decision about these sites, and it was a deliberate decision to go to the storage facilities, to go to the research and development facilities. That was the difference. We think by doing this, this was very successful, and we are confident that we've significantly degraded his ability to ever use chemical weapons again.
One more. And what kind of response should the Assad regime expect from the U.S. if they were to use chemical weapons again?
One, I think it's very important to remember that that this represents 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council who did this. The UK and France are our oldest allies. This is about values. We did this because it's intolerable for any civilized nation to tolerate the use of chemical weapons.
Thank you.
Missy.
Thank you. I just have one follow-up on Michael's question for you, General, and a question for you, Dana. General, can you just, to press you a little bit on the chemical weapons program, can you give us an idea of, should the American public understand that this is a minority of the existing chemical weapons programs? Is this more than half? Is there any way you can give us a better sense of the scale of what these 3 sites represented? Also for you, General, how long did the strike last? How many minutes, hours? And Dana, for you, can you just comment on, to put this a little bit in the context of the broader civil war? I know that the U.S. policy is not to get engaged in the civil war, and that the objective is to get to a negotiated settlement eventually. But we have this significant military response to chemical attacks that in this instance killed an estimated 45 people. At the same time, the Assad regime has continued to use conventional means to attack women and children, civilians repeatedly using barrel bombs and other means. Can you just talk about that? How should people understand the difference in the response to these more isolated chemical attacks and the ongoing conventional attacks by the Assad government on its own people?
It is clear to everyone that the Syrian people have suffered for too long. And it's why we are 100% behind the UN-backed Geneva peace process. And we encourage our allies and partners in the region to also help facilitate that conversation. We have a new UN envoy, and this is an opportunity to really put real steam behind the process. But our mission in Syria remains the same. It is to defeat ISIS. It is not to be involved in the civil war. Christina.
Sorry.
It's Christina, yeah. I'm sorry. There you go.
Missy, so your 2-part question. First, we believe that by hitting bars in particular, we've attacked the heart of the Syrian chemical weapons program. Now, I'm not saying that they're not going to be able to reconstitute it. And I'm not saying that it's going to continue. But this has dealt them a very serious blow. So I think that's the core of what I'm saying. Second point is, how long did the attack last? As you know, an operation like this has many, many elements. From a 0-400 time on target, which all our missiles impacted within a minute or 2 of that time, really several hours before you begin to launch tankers, you begin to launch intelligence aircraft, you begin to do a variety of things. Probably a couple hours before would be the period of maximum intensity for the mission. That's when you're beginning to spin and launch the T-LAMs from the ships. That's when your other aircraft are beginning to get to the point where they're going to release their missiles. But the operation actually many hours before in order to just get set up.
Christina.
What would trigger another wave of coalition attacks? Are we talking another chemical weapons attack or retaliation? And do we expect any retaliation either from the regime, the Russians, or the Iranians?
I can't speculate on what could happen, but what I will tell you is that this, we took action, and what happens next is the decision of Assad.
And also, do we expect any kind of retaliation?
So I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that we're ready for it. We're postured both in the region and globally. We're on the balls of our feet, and we're ready for anything.
Tony.
General, a couple questions. One, was this the least extensive of all the options that were crafted? Can you give us a feel for how many options were put together, and was this the one that would meet at the least amount of damage?
So I would tell you that we can't comment on options we present to the president. That's a choice he makes, so I'm not going to be able to discuss that. I will tell you that of all the options, carefully looked at ways to minimize collateral damage. You balance always minimizing collateral damage against getting maximum effect. These are three targets that seem to hit the sweet spot and do that.
What impact did the very public prelude to this attack have on military planning in terms of enveloping it in maybe a 21st century bodyguard of lies, in terms of deception on ship movements? What impact did it have on possibly launch accesses of the aircraft or ships used? We were all focused on the Donald Cook, and the Donald Cook wasn't used. Can you give some sense of that?
Sure. If I could build on your bodyguard of lies comment, the truth is it had no effect on military planning. It had no effect on military planning.
David.
Yes?
Okay.
David Martin.
I thought I heard you say that this strike put more steam behind the Geneva peace process. How does this help bring peace to Syria?
The UN, we have been very clear about the fact that we fully support the UN-backed Geneva process. Sochi has failed. Our focus remains defeating ISIS. It is not to get involved in the Syrian civil war. We call on all nations, and I think the demonstration of our allies, France and the UK, helping us, demonstrates that we are serious about the fact that chemical weapons use is intolerable, it's inexcusable, but we will remain committed to the 70-nation coalition to defeat ISIS.
But how does defending the use of chemical weapons affect the outcome of the Syrian civil war?
It affects it by, again, demonstrating to the world that this is a heinous regime. This is a regime that murders its own people daily. We, yesterday, with the help of our allies, addressed the fact that they continue to use chemical weapons against their own people. We continue to hope and urge, and we're confident that the UN process will move forward. But our mission remains to defeat ISIS. There is still work to be done, and we will do it. Right here and right here.
I'm going to ask three quick questions. First, were you ready yesterday to engage Russian targets in case Russia responded to that attack? Second, you keep talking about the current Syrian chemical program. Can you give us an idea about the size of this program in comparison to what the regime had before dismantling it? What is in percentage? And third, you're talking about evidence of chemical weapons attack. We haven't seen any evidence, really. That's what you're saying. However, there's an organization on the ground in Syria, the OPCW, and it will conduct an investigation. Why didn't you wait for that investigation to end?
Well, let's remember that OPCW and others have been blocked from entering Ghouta and Douma. That's because of the Assad regime. We need to remember that everything that's happening with respect to the murder of these people, innocent people, is the responsibility of the Assad regime. So we were very confident about the evidence that we had. And it was clear. And the Secretary said yesterday, he was very confident about the intelligence as well as the evidence. And that's why we moved forward.
Then the two other questions on Russia and the size of the
Sure.
chemical
We have
program.
an active, effective deconfliction channel with Russia. It's been used months before this attack. It was used through this strike, and it's been used afterwards. And I'm not going to be able to comment on anything more specific on
The
that.
size of the program, the current program that what the Syrian regime has now? Because you said, like, you made lots of assessment, you have a good idea, you have lots of targets. So in comparison to what the Assad regime
I
had
would say
before,
there's still a residual element of the Syrian program that's out there. I believe that we took the heart of it out with the attacks that we accomplished last night. I'm not going to say that they're going to be unable to continue to conduct a chemical attack in the future. I suspect, however, they'll think long and hard about it based on the activities of last night.
We have time for a couple more questions. Idris.
Thanks, Dana. President Trump tweeted about an hour ago, mission accomplished, which, of course, historically has not borne out when the phrase has been used. And you're saying that if, you've left the option open for future strikes in case chemical weapons are used again. So could you sort of reconcile those two statements, mission accomplished and could be used in the future? In terms of authorities, if there are other strikes, does Secretary have to go to President Trump, or has he been delegated the authority to carry them out as he sees fit?
So to your first point, last night's operations were very successful. We met our objectives. We hit the sites, the heart of the chem weapons program. So it was mission accomplished. Give me your second part.
Second part is the authorities question. If there are future strikes, does the same process have to go where you go to the NSC and the PCC? What is the process now?
As the Secretary said last night, the President has the authority under Article 2 to defend U.S. interests and national interests. And so I'm not going to speculate on anything that happens in the future, but this was a fully legitimate operation. Ryan.
General McKenzie, did the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, did he communicate with General Gerasimov in the days or hours leading up to this strike? And then, in addition, do you assess that this has actually fundamentally changed the military balance of the Syrian civil war, or is the Assad regime maintaining its advantage?
So I go back to some of the things I've already said about the deconfliction channel with the Russians. It's a multi-level, robust system of communication that we've employed for some time. I'm not going to be able to give you any more information on a particular conversation that the chairman may or may not have had. What was the second part of your question?
Military balance of the civil war. Do these strikes fundamentally affect that, or is the Assad regime's apparent ascendancy remain?
I think our strikes were targeted to send a message about the employment of chemical weapons, and I think they were successful achieving that military objective.
Well, I want to get someone who hasn't spoken, but way in the back here. Con.
Channel 4 News. Thank you, Dana. Just following up on Idris's question, this question of mission accomplished. If the mission is to deter President Assad from spreading chemical weapons, isn't it actually impossible at this stage militarily to know whether that mission, as described, was accomplished?
Last night's operations were successful. We met all of our objectives. We hit all of our targets successfully. No aircrafts, allied aircrafts were engaged. It was a successful mission. What happens next depends on what the Assad regime decides to do. Right over here.
Thanks, Patrick Tucker, Defense One. You said earlier that you didn't observe any material effects on forces during the strike. Can you describe any other effects, electromagnetic or cyber effects that were perhaps targeted towards coalition craft? And also, have you observed any activity around residual or remaining sites that you didn't strike that suggests perhaps an after-action plan to hide or use chemical weapons in some other way?
The Syrian response was remarkably ineffective in all domains. That's probably the best answer I can give you. So they had no material impact on the strike. As I noted in my prepared comments, they actually typically began to fire their missiles after the last impact of our weapon. So no appreciable effect that we know at this time.
Any observable activity around sites?
Can I follow up?
Aaron.
Just a couple of clarification points. Thanks, Dana. General McKenzie, you said, I believe there's still an air defense package in operation right now in case there's potential for retaliation from either Syrian or Russian assets. How long do you intend to keep that package in the area, specifically keeping an eye on if there's kind of a retaliation to this strike? And then during the strikes last year, a couple of the TLAMs, I believe, failed, just not because of interference, but they just failed. Were there any weapons that didn't make it to their targets this time?
None of our Tomahawks experienced any problems.
What about the air-launched weapons?
I don't believe so. No. And your last question, we typically keep DCA over deployed forces in eastern Syria. So typically we've got aircraft up over them. So this would, as we open in time from the event going forward, the commander will continually readjust the air defense posture that we've got. Right now it's robust, and we'll keep it robust for a while, then we'll make adjustments just based on our observations of the environment.
Lucas.
General, the Syrian government is saying they shot down over a dozen Tomahawks. Are they lying? And what Syrian military units did you strike? And for the people at home, can you explain this deconfliction? You say you didn't coordinate or give a heads up to the Russians, but you said you deconflicted. And Dana, finally, you say you want to avoid conflict with Syria, yet with all due respect, you just lobbed a couple dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles into the country. Can you explain that?
Our mission stays the same. It's to defeat ISIS. But Assad's actions were beyond the pale. Again, we will 100%, and we are supporting Envoy de Mistura. We will continue to do that because we want a diplomatic, political resolution to the Syrian conflict. But civilized nations can't let what's happened in Syria stand. So with that, I'm going to... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So you asked about deconfliction. Probably the best way to understand it is this. The Russians don't have a veto on anything that we do. And that's probably the best way to describe it. We're not cooperating with them in Syria. We don't want to get into a fight with them. They don't want to get into a fight with us. The best way to do that is to share certain information about what you're doing, carefully metered out by us, and I'm sure the same by them. But we're not cooperating with them, and they have no veto over what we do. At the same time, we owe it to our servicemen and women and those of our coalition partners to do the best we can to simplify the environment in which we're going to fight. So the deconfliction mechanisms allow us to do that. As to the last part of your question, I can't help you with what the Syrians are saying or not saying. What I'm telling you is what actually happened.
And on that point,
All right, so that was General Kenneth McKenzie, the Director of Joint Staff, and also the Chief Pentagon spokesperson, Diana White, there addressing the media and talking about the missile strikes that were carried out by the United States, Britain and France, stating that the operation was a complete and a resounding success. And despite what the Syrians and also the Russians have said, stating that some of the missiles perhaps were intercepted, the Americans are maintaining that no missiles were intercepted. None of their aircrafts were challenged as they carried out the operation. So the objective with which the Americans and the French and also the British had gone in has now been accomplished, is how the Pentagon briefing has decided to put it.